They threw my lunch in the trash and told me to eat with the dogs outside. The words echoed in Margaret's mind as she stood frozen in the marble hallway of the Whitmore mansion, her arthritic hands still trembling from what had just happened. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might change how you see the invisible people around you. Margaret Elena Vasquez had been cleaning the same marble floors for 18 years, her knees worn raw from kneeling beside toilets that cost more than most people's cars. At 63, her back curved like a question mark from decades of bending over bathtubs the size of small swimming pools, scrubbing away the evidence of lives lived in luxury, while her own remained hidden in the shadows of their excess. The Whitmore estate in Beverly Hills sprawled across 3 acres of manicured perfection, its walls lined with artwork worth more than Margaret's entire neighborhood in East LA. Each morning at 5:30, she would take 2 buses and walk 8 blocks to reach the servants' entrance, a modest door tucked behind perfectly trimmed hedges, where people like her were meant to disappear into the background of other people's lives. Her uniform, a gray dress that had faded to the color of old dishwater after countless washings, hung loose on her shrinking frame. The fabric, once crisp and professional, now bore the invisible stains of 18 years of service, the bleach marks from cleaning their bathrooms, the small burns from their iron, the stretched seams from reaching into corners they would never see but expected to gleam. Margaret's reflection in the mansion's mirrors told a story she tried not to read too closely. Her once dark hair had turned silver white, pulled back in a bun so tight it gave her headaches by afternoon. Her face, mapped with lines that spoke of worry and sleepless nights, had developed the particular expression of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, eyes downcast, shoulders curved inward, presence diminished to the point where she moved through rooms like a ghost haunting someone else's life. This morning had started like every other Tuesday for the past 18 years. Margaret arrived before the family woke, her key turning silently in the servants' entrance as the mansion slept in expensive silence. She moved through her routine with the precision of someone who had memorized every corner, every surface, every expectation of a household that functioned only because people like her made it function. But today, something was different. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, draped in a silk robe that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, had descended the grand staircase earlier than usual. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against her coffee cup as she surveyed the breakfast room where Margaret was polishing the chandelier, standing precariously on a ladder that wobbled with each careful movement. "Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. "We need to discuss your performance." Margaret's hands stilled on the crystal, her heart beginning that familiar rhythm of fear that came whenever Mrs. Whitmore used that particular tone. In 18 years, she had learned to read the subtle signs of displeasure that preceded the storms that could destroy her carefully maintained stability. "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, climbing down the ladder with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every shift in position. She stood before Mrs. Whitmore with her hands clasped, eyes focused on the Persian rug that probably cost more than her daughter's college education had. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Whitmore continued, circling Margaret like a predator who had found cornered prey, "about efficiency, about value, about whether we're really getting what we pay for in this arrangement." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Margaret felt her chest tighten with the familiar panic that came whenever her employment was questioned. This job wasn't just income. It was survival. It was health insurance. It was the difference between her small apartment and the street, between dignity and desperation. "The silver isn't as bright as it used to be," Mrs. Whitmore observed, running her finger along a serving tray that gleamed like a mirror. "The floors don't sparkle the way they did when you were younger, stronger." Margaret wanted to explain that her hands shook now from arthritis medication she couldn't afford to take regularly, that her knees swelled so badly some mornings that she had to grip the banister to climb the stairs to the second floor, that she still completed every task on the endless list Mrs. Whitmore left each morning, just slower now, with more breaks, with the stubborn determination of someone who refused to admit defeat. Instead, she said, "I'll work harder, Mum. I can stay later. I can—" "Oh, Margaret." Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp and cold. "You don't understand. This isn't about working harder. This is about working smarter, about recognizing when it's time to make changes." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 18 years of perfect attendance, of missed holidays with her own family, of cleaning up after their parties while her own life remained uncelebrated, all of it reduced to a conversation about efficiency and value. "I found something interesting in your locker yesterday," Mrs. Whitmore continued, producing a small photograph that Margaret recognized with a jolt of horror. It was a picture of her grandson's graduation, tucked behind her cleaning supplies where she thought no one would ever look. Taking personal time to look at family photos during work hours shows a concerning lack of focus, don't you think? Margaret's throat closed with the injustice of it. The photograph had been there for 3 years, pulled out only during her 10-minute lunch breaks, when she needed to remember why she endured the humiliation, why she swallowed her pride daily, why she made herself invisible for people who saw her as nothing more than animated furniture. And then there's the matter of food. Mrs. Whitmore's voice took on the tone she used when discussing particularly distasteful topics. "I noticed you've been eating your lunch in the kitchen. That really isn't appropriate. The kitchen is for food preparation, not for personal dining." Margaret's sandwich, peanut butter and jelly on day-old bread, had been her same lunch for years. She ate it standing at the counter during her brief break, never sitting down, never using their dishes, never presuming to claim space that wasn't designated for someone of her status. "I think from now on," Mrs. Whitmore said with the casual cruelty of someone who had never known hunger, "you should eat outside, with the gardening staff. It's more appropriate for your level." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. 18 years of service, of loyalty, of making their lives beautiful while her own remained small and hidden, and she was being told to eat with the dogs outside because her presence in their kitchen was somehow contaminating. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret began, her voice barely a whisper, "I've worked here for 18 years. I've never missed a day. I've never broken anything. I've never—" "And we appreciate that," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, with the dismissive tone of someone ending a conversation. "But appreciation doesn't change reality. You're getting older, Margaret. Slower, less valuable. And frankly, we need to start thinking about the future." She handed Margaret a brown paper bag. "Your lunch. I think you'll find the patio much more suitable for someone in your position." Margaret took the bag with hands that had forgotten how to stop shaking, watching as Mrs. Whitmore glided away on silent feet, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the lingering poison of words designed to remind Margaret exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of human worth. Standing alone in the marble hallway, surrounded by artwork that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime, Margaret Elena Vasquez felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been breaking slowly for years. This was something deeper, more fundamental. This was the moment when a woman who had spent 18 years making herself invisible finally understood that she had succeeded too well. She had become nothing. And for the first time in 18 years, Margaret wondered if she had the strength to become something more. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the brown paper bag containing her exile, remembering the first day she had walked through these same marble halls with hope, instead of resignation weighing down her shoulders. 18 years ago, she had been 45 and desperate, newly widowed with a teenage daughter whose college dreams hung in the balance like Margaret's own future. The Whitmores had seemed like salvation then, a steady job with benefits. A chance to rebuild after her husband's sudden death had shattered not just her heart, but her financial security. "You're lucky we even let you work here," Mrs. Whitmore had told her during that first interview, looking at Margaret's discount store dress and second-hand shoes with the critical eye of someone evaluating livestock. "Most families prefer younger help, but my previous housekeeper recommended you, and she said you were thorough." The word thorough had become Margaret's prison sentence, translated over the years into expectations that grew heavier with each passing season. Thorough meant cleaning baseboards with a toothbrush. Thorough meant polishing silver until it gleamed like mirrors. Thorough meant working through lunch breaks to meet impossible standards that shifted like sand beneath her feet. She remembered the Christmas morning when little Jennifer Whitmore had vomited on the antique Persian rug after eating too much candy. Margaret had spent her entire Christmas day on her hands and knees, using specialized cleaners and techniques she'd researched at the library, saving a rug worth more than her annual salary. The Whitmores had returned from their ski vacation in Aspen 3 days later, stepping over the pristine rug, without a word of acknowledgement, as if expensive carpets cleaned themselves through divine intervention. "Margaret, the silver needs redoing," Mrs. Whitmore had announced that same week, running her white glove across surfaces that already gleamed. "I can see water spots. Are you sure you're using the proper technique?" Margaret had polished that silver until her shoulders ached and her hands cramped, until she could see her own tired reflection multiplied in every surface. She'd developed a system: newspaper followed by microfiber cloth, then a final buff with chamois leather she'd bought with her own money because it left fewer streaks than the supplies the Whitmores provided. But perfection was a moving target in a house where the staff existed to anticipate needs that were never clearly expressed, to solve problems that were never fully explained, to maintain standards that evolved without notice or consultation. "You know what I love about Margaret?" Mrs. Whitmore had told her bridge club one afternoon, speaking as if Margaret were a particularly well-trained appliance rather than a human being standing 3 feet away. "She's so reliable. Like a good washing machine. You just press the button and everything gets clean." The women had laughed, sipping tea from cups worth more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, while Margaret continued dusting the bookshelf that held first edition novels none of them had ever read. Their laughter had followed her through the rest of her shift, echoing in her ears as she scrubbed their toilets and folded their silk lingerie with the same mechanical precision they so admired. Margaret had learned to make herself smaller with each passing year, to anticipate criticism before it was voiced, to apologize for problems she hadn't created. When Mr. Whitmore's golf clubs went missing, later found in his country club locker where he'd left them, Margaret had apologized for not somehow preventing his forgetfulness. When their daughter Jennifer crashed her BMW while texting, into a tree, thankfully, and not another person, Margaret had apologized for not having detailed the car the previous week, as if pristine leather seats could have prevented teenage recklessness. "I'm sorry" had become her default response to everything, a verbal reflex that protected her from confrontations she couldn't afford to have. Sorry for existing, sorry for aging, sorry for having a grandson whose graduation photo reminded them that she had a life beyond their marble walls. The memories cascaded through her mind as she stood in the hallway, each one a small death of dignity she'd absorbed and stored away like broken promises in the back of a forgotten drawer. The time Mrs. Whitmore had made her re-vacuum the entire house because a single pine needle from their Christmas tree had escaped her notice. The birthday when she'd worked a double shift because their regular caterer had cancelled, missing her own daughter's celebration to serve hors d'oeuvres to people who complained the champagne wasn't cold enough, the raises that never came, despite 18 years of inflation that made her original salary increasingly inadequate. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Margaret," Mr. Whitmore would say whenever she gathered the courage to ask. Usually around the same time, he traded in his Bentley for a newer model or announced plans for another European vacation. She'd watched Jennifer Whitmore grow from a spoiled child into an entitled young woman who spoke to Margaret with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been taught that service workers were human beings deserving of basic respect. "Margaret, my room is disgusting," Jennifer would announce, leaving towels on the floor and makeup scattered across surfaces like abandoned art projects, as if creating messes was a creative expression and cleaning them was someone else's natural calling. Margaret had cleaned Jennifer's vomit from silk curtains after high school parties. She'd laundered grass stains from designer dresses after garden party mishaps. She'd polished blood from Jennifer's shoes after a horseback riding accident, working with the concentration of someone restoring priceless artifacts rather than cleaning evidence of teenage carelessness. "She's practically family," Mrs. Whitmore would tell visitors, the phrase delivered with the particular warmth reserved for discussing beloved pets or well-functioning appliances. "We just couldn't manage without her." But family members didn't eat their lunches standing in kitchens. Family members weren't told to use the servants' bathroom instead of the guest powder room. Family members weren't reminded, subtly but consistently, that their presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, that their service was expected rather than appreciated. The worst part wasn't the work itself. Margaret had always taken pride in transforming chaos into order, in making beautiful things more beautiful through her careful attention. The worst part was the slow erosion of herself, the gradual understanding that she'd become professionally invisible, existing only as a function rather than a person. "Margaret works so hard," the Whitmores would tell their friends, "but you know how these people are. They're just grateful for steady work." These people. The phrase had become a category that defined her entire existence in their world. Hard-working but simple, grateful but not ambitious, Useful, but not important. These people didn't have dreams that extended beyond service. These people didn't have family traditions, or personal disappointments, or private hopes that kept them awake at night, staring at ceilings in apartments the Whitmores would never see. Margaret wondered for the first time in 18 years if she had been complicit in her own diminishment. Had her quietness been mistaken for contentment? Had her reliability been interpreted as a lack of ambition? Had her loyalty been seen as evidence that she was satisfied with a life measured entirely by her usefulness to others? Standing in the marble hallway, clutching the brown bag that represented her new status as someone unfit to share kitchen space with appliances, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of stillness. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter but more dangerous. It was the beginning of a question she'd never allowed herself to ask. What if she was worth more than this? The afternoon sun streamed through windows she'd cleaned 1,000 times, casting patterns on floors she'd polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Whitmore was probably planning her next social event, making lists of things that would need to be perfect, arrangements that would require Margaret's invisible labor to execute flawlessly. But for the first time in 18 years, Margaret Elena Vasquez stood in those marble halls and wondered what would happen if she simply stopped. The brown bag felt heavier with each step as Margaret walked toward the servants' exit, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble that had become both her domain and her prison. But as she reached the French doors leading to the patio, voices from the morning room stopped her cold. "Did you see her face when you told her to eat outside?" Jennifer Whitmore's laughter carried the sharp edge of someone who had inherited cruelty along with her trust fund. "I thought she might actually cry right there in the hallway." Margaret pressed herself against the wall, hidden behind the tall potted palm that she watered twice weekly, her breath catching in her throat as the conversation continued. "Oh, darling, that's nothing." Mrs. Whitmore's voice dripped with amusement. "You should have seen her when I went through her locker yesterday, clutching that little photo like it was some precious treasure. These people and their sentiment, it's almost touching in its simplicity." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her chest, where she kept a small wallet containing that same photo, her grandson Roberto in his cap and gown, the first person in their family to graduate college. She had worked double shifts for months to help pay for his textbooks, scrubbing floors and polishing silver, while dreaming of the moment she could sit in those graduation ceremony bleachers and watch him walk across that stage. "The best part," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice growing more animated, "is that she actually thinks we value her. 18 years of the same routine, the same grateful little smile, the same, 'Yes, ma'am,' 'No, ma'am.' It's like having a very well-trained dog that never realizes it's a dog." Margaret's legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath her, the brown bag slipping from her fingers to land with a soft thud on the marble floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the space between her ears and her heart, which had begun beating with the irregular rhythm of something breaking. "Mother, you're terrible," Jennifer giggled. "But honestly, she is getting so slow. So yesterday I asked her to clean my bathroom, and it took her like 2 hours. I could have done it myself in 20 minutes. That's exactly what I told Victoria Hampton yesterday," Mrs. Whitmore replied, referring to her closest friend and neighbor. "I said, 'Vicky, I think it's time to upgrade. These older domestics, they start to fall apart just like old appliances. You wouldn't keep a washing machine that only worked half the time, would you?'" Margaret's vision blurred as the words hit her like physical blows. 18 years of perfect service, of sacrificing her own family time for theirs, of missing her daughter's birthday dinners and her grandson's soccer games, all reduced to the metaphor of a failing appliance that needed replacing. "What did Mrs. Hampton say?" Jennifer asked, and Margaret could hear the rustle of newspaper pages, the casual clink of expensive china, the sounds of a leisurely morning that her invisible labor had made possible. "Oh, she completely agreed. She said her housekeeper Rosa is getting the same way. Slower, more forgetful, less enthusiastic. We've been thinking about going in together on a service. You know, younger girls who actually appreciate the opportunity, fresh energy, better attitudes." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat as the conversation continued, each word stripping away another layer of the dignity she'd fought so hard to maintain. They weren't discussing her performance or her future. They were discussing her disposal, with the same casual consideration they might give to replacing an outdated piece of furniture. "The thing is, Mrs." Whitmore's voice dropped to the conspiratorial tone she used when sharing particularly delicious gossip. Margaret has no idea how replaceable she really is. She thinks because she's been here so long, she's somehow essential. It's almost sweet, really. Sweet? Jennifer's voice carried genuine curiosity. Well, pathetic might be a better word, the way she looks at us sometimes, like we're her family or something. As if 18 years of employment creates some kind of bond beyond the financial arrangement. It's the kind of thinking that keeps these people in their place, really. Confusing professional courtesy with personal affection. Margaret's hand found the wall behind her, gripping the smooth surface as if it could anchor her to a world that was suddenly spinning out of control. Professional courtesy. That's what she had mistaken for 18 years of mutual respect. The Christmas bonuses. The occasional good work, Margaret. The times Mrs. Whitmore had asked about her health during particularly difficult periods. All of it had been professional courtesy, performed with the same calculation they used when tipping restaurant servers or doormen. I mean, where would she go, Mrs. Whitmore continued. She's 63, with arthritis and no real skills beyond housekeeping. Who else would hire someone that old? We're really doing her a favor by keeping her on as long as we have. The conversation shifted to lunch plans and shopping trips, but Margaret could no longer hear individual words through the roaring in her ears. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the marble floor, her grey uniform spreading around her like the wings of a broken bird. 18 years. 18 years of believing she was building something meaningful, creating relationships that transcended the employer-employee dynamic. 18 years of taking pride in their compliments, finding purpose in their satisfaction, measuring her own worth by their approval. All of it had been a carefully constructed illusion, as artificial as the silk flowers she dusted in their guest bedrooms. Margaret thought about the Christmas mornings she'd missed with her own family, arriving early to prepare their holiday brunch, while her daughter and grandson opened presents without her. She remembered the times she'd stayed late to serve their dinner parties, cleaning up until midnight while they entertained friends who never learned her name, who referred to her only as the help when they acknowledged her presence at all. She thought about the voice she'd lost somewhere along the way, the woman who used to speak her mind, who had opinions about politics and books and music, who had dreams that extended beyond other people's satisfaction. When had she become so small? When had she learned to swallow her thoughts, her needs, her very self, until nothing remained but the function she performed? The brown bag lay beside her on the floor, its contents probably crushed now, another small humiliation in a day that had already redefined the limits of her endurance. She was supposed to take it outside and eat with the gardening staff, men who at least worked in sunlight and fresh air, who created beauty rather than simply maintaining it for others to enjoy. Margaret picked up the bag and struggled to her feet, her knees protesting with the sharp pain that had become her constant companion. But instead of heading toward the patio doors, she found herself walking toward the morning room, toward the voices that had just stripped away the last of her illusions. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Mrs. Whitmore and Jennifer in their silk robes and perfect makeup, surrounded by the newspapers and coffee cups and fresh flowers that marked the beginning of another day in their effortless existence. They looked up at her with mild surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed the ability to move independently. "Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying a note of irritation, "is there something you need? I thought we discussed your lunch arrangements." Margaret looked at them, really looked at them, for what felt like the first time in 18 years. She saw the casual cruelty in their expressions, the complete absence of guilt or shame about the conversation she'd overheard, the profound indifference to her humanity that had shaped every interaction they'd ever had. "I heard you," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. Mrs. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "Heard what, Margaret?" "Everything. About the dog, about the appliance, about how replaceable I am." For a moment, silence stretched between them like a chasm opening in the marble floor. Then Mrs. Whitmore's face shifted into the expression of someone who had been caught in an awkward situation but felt no genuine remorse about it. "Margaret, I think you may have misunderstood." "No," Margaret interrupted, the word emerging with a strength that surprised them all. "I understood perfectly." She placed the brown bag on their breakfast table, right next to the fresh orchid arrangement she had refreshed that morning, between the crystal juice glasses she had polished to perfection and the sterling silver cutlery she had cleaned until it gleamed. For the first time in 18 years, Margaret Elena Vasquez looked Victoria Whitmore directly in the eyes and refused to look away. I quit, she said simply. And in that moment, something inside her that had been broken for years began, slowly and quietly, to heal. The silence that followed Margaret's declaration stretched like a frozen moment in time, heavy with the weight of 18 years of unspoken truths finally finding their voice. Mrs. Whitmore's coffee cup remained suspended halfway to her lips, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the delicate china as if it were the only solid thing in a suddenly shifting world. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had never been challenged by anyone she considered beneath her station. "Did you just say you quit?" Margaret stood straighter than she had in years, feeling vertebrae align that had been curved in submission for so long she'd forgotten they could support her full height. "Yes, ma'am, I quit." Jennifer laughed, a sound like crystal breaking, high and brittle and completely devoid of humor. "Mother, she can't just quit. She has nowhere else to go. What's she going to do, become a rocket scientist?" The casual cruelty of the comment hung in the air like poison gas, but for the first time in 18 years, Margaret didn't absorb it into her chest like a wound to be hidden and endured. Instead, she let it bounce off her like rain off stone, recognizing it for what it truly was, the desperate meanness of people who had never learned to find worth in anything beyond their inherited advantages. "Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore set down her coffee cup with the deliberate precision of someone reasserting control over a situation that had momentarily slipped beyond her management. "Let's not be hasty. You're obviously upset about something. Perhaps we should discuss this rationally." The word rationally was delivered with the particular condescension reserved for employees who had forgotten their place, a verbal pat on the head designed to restore the natural order of things. Margaret had heard that tone countless times before. Whenever she'd asked for time off to attend her daughter's surgery, whenever she'd mentioned that her arthritis was making the stairs difficult, whenever she'd dared to suggest that perhaps the expectations placed upon her might be unreasonable for someone her age. "You're right," Margaret said quietly. "I should have been rational 18 years ago, when I first let you convince me that my time was worth less than yours, that my family was less important than yours, that my dignity was negotiable." Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted into something Margaret had never seen before, not anger exactly, but a kind of shocked displeasure, as if a favorite appliance had suddenly developed opinions about its treatment. "Margaret, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. Perhaps you should sit down and we can discuss whatever is troubling you." "What's troubling me," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is that I spent 18 years believing I was valued here, that the Christmas bonuses meant appreciation instead of charity, that asking about my health meant you cared instead of making sure your investment would keep functioning." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her silk pajamas, suddenly finding her manicured nails fascinating enough to require intense study. For the first time since Margaret had known her, the young woman seemed to have nothing cutting to say, no easy cruelty to deploy against someone who was no longer cowering under the weight of their judgment. "You're being dramatic," Mrs. Whitmore said, but something in her voice had changed, a note of uncertainty that suggested she was beginning to understand that this conversation was not following the script she had written for how such interactions were supposed to proceed. "We've always treated you fairly. We've given you steady employment, health insurance, regular raises." Regular raises. Margaret's laugh surprised them all, including herself. When had she last laughed in this house? "Mrs. Whitmore, my salary today is exactly $12 more per week than it was when I started 18 years ago. Do you know what $12 buys now? A single lunch at the restaurant where you take your friends." The mathematics of exploitation hung in the air between them, impossible to deny or rationalize away. Margaret had calculated those numbers during countless sleepless nights when her arthritis made rest impossible, adding up the years of inflation that had eroded her buying power, while the Whitmore's lifestyle had expanded like an ever-growing bubble of privilege that never touched the ground where people like her lived. "We've been generous with your health insurance, Mrs. Whitmore countered, grasping for moral high ground that was rapidly eroding beneath her feet. "You've been legally required to provide health insurance," Margaret corrected, "and the deductible is so high that I haven't been able to afford to actually use it for 3 years. Do you know how many nights I've lain awake in pain because I couldn't afford the copay for my arthritis medication? Do you know how many times I've worked through illness because I couldn't afford to lose a day's pay?" The questions landed like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the comfortable fiction that had allowed the Whitmores to sleep peacefully in their king-sized beds, while Margaret struggled to make ends meet on what they considered generous compensation. Mr. Whitmore chose that moment to appear in the doorway, his golf attire suggesting he was preparing for another day of leisure that Margaret's labor would help finance. "What's all the commotion about?" he asked, taking in the scene with the casual interest of someone observing a minor domestic disturbance. "Margaret is having some kind of episode," Mrs. Whitmore explained, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone dealing with unreasonable help. "She says she's quitting." Mr. Whitmore looked at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time, which wasn't far from the truth. In 18 years, their conversations had rarely extended beyond basic instructions and polite acknowledgments of her presence. She existed in his world as background functionality, like the heating system or the security cameras, essential for comfort, but not requiring personal attention. "Margaret," he said, with the tone of someone addressing a confused child, "let's be practical here. You're 63 years old with limited skills and no college education. The job market isn't exactly favorable for someone in your situation. We're offering you steady work, predictable income, and the kind of security that most people your age would be grateful to have." The word grateful hit Margaret like a slap across the face, carrying with it the accumulated weight of 18 years of being told, in countless subtle ways, that she should be thankful for the privilege of serving people who saw her as fundamentally less valuable than themselves. "Grateful," Margaret repeated, tasting the word like something bitter that had been forced down her throat for years. "You want me to be grateful for the opportunity to clean your toilets, while you vacation in Europe with money that comes from people like me, accepting less than we're worth?" Mr. Whitmore's expression hardened into something Margaret recognized, the look of a man who had never been challenged by anyone he considered his social inferior, whose entire sense of self depended on maintaining hierarchies that placed him permanently above people like her. "Now listen here," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. But Margaret was no longer listening to the words. Instead, she was hearing the tone, recognizing it as the same one he used when discussing stock prices or golf handicaps, or any other matter that required attention, but not emotional investment. At that moment, a small voice from the doorway interrupted the confrontation that had been building for 18 years. "What's wrong with Margaret?" Everyone turned to see Tommy Whitmore, Jennifer's 8-year-old son, standing in his school uniform with his backpack over one shoulder and a look of genuine concern on his face. He was the only member of the family who had ever spoken to Margaret as if she were a real person, who asked about her grandson and remembered her birthday and sometimes drew her pictures that she kept in her small apartment like treasures. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Mrs. Whitmore said quickly, moving to block Tommy's view of the adult confrontation that was unfolding in their breakfast room. "Margaret just needs to get back to work." But Tommy stepped around his grandmother with the determination of a child who sensed that something important was happening, something that the adults were trying to hide from him. "Margaret," he said, looking up at her with eyes that held the kind of uncomplicated kindness that hadn't yet been trained out of him, "are you sad? You look like you've been crying." Margaret knelt down to Tommy's eye level, ignoring the sharp protest from her arthritic knees, and found herself looking into the face of the only person in this house who had ever seen her as fully human. "I'm not sad, Tommy," she said gently. "I'm just done." "Done with what?" Margaret glanced up at the three adults watching this exchange with varying degrees of discomfort, then back at the child who deserved an honest answer, even if no one else did. "Done pretending that being invisible is the same thing as being valued," she said softly. And for the first time in 18 years, Margaret Elena Vasquez walked out of the Whitmore mansion through the front door, like a guest leaving after a visit, rather than an employee dismissed from service. The Beverly Hills sidewalk beneath Margaret's feet felt foreign after 18 years of entering and exiting through hidden service entrances. The afternoon sun hit her face directly for the first time in memory, not filtered through kitchen windows while she worked, but warming her skin as she stood still, breathing air that didn't carry the scent of cleaning chemicals and other people's expectations. Her hands shook as she reached the bus stop, not from fear but from the adrenaline of a confrontation that had been building in her chest for nearly 2 decades. She sat on the metal bench, her grey uniform wrinkled from the morning's humiliations, and tried to process what she had just done. She had quit, without notice, without a plan, without the safety net that had kept her tethered to a life that had slowly been strangling her soul. The bus that would take her back to East LA was 20 minutes away, giving her time to fully absorb the magnitude of her decision. No more steady paycheck, no more health insurance, inadequate as it had been. No more guaranteed roof over her head, since her small apartment's rent depended entirely on the Whitmore salary that she had just walked away from, but also no more swallowing humiliation with her morning coffee. No more pretending gratitude for cruelbs of respect. No more making herself invisible while polishing mirrors that reflected everyone's importance except her own. Margaret's phone buzzed in her uniform pocket, an ancient flip phone that the Whitmores had occasionally mocked as vintage when they noticed it at all. The caller ID showed her daughter Sophia's number, and Margaret hesitated before answering. How do you tell your child that you've just destroyed the financial stability you've sacrificed everything to maintain? Mommy? Sophia's voice carried the warmth that had sustained Margaret through 18 years of cold marble hallways. I'm on my lunch break and wanted to check on you. You sounded tired when we talked yesterday. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten for the first time since walking out of the mansion. Sophia worked 2 jobs to support her own family, while helping Margaret with occasional expenses, stretching her teacher's salary to cover what Margaret's wages couldn't reach. How could she explain that she had just made their precarious financial situation impossible? I'm okay, Mika, Margaret managed, watching luxury cars glide past the bus stop like schools of expensive fish, swimming through a world she had served but never inhabited. You don't sound okay. What happened? Did Mrs. Whitmore give you a hard time again? The question hung in the air, loaded with 18 years of conversations where Margaret had minimized, rationalized, and hidden the daily indignities she endured. Sophia knew the Whitmores were difficult, but Margaret had never shared the full extent of their cruelty, protecting her daughter from the knowledge that her mother's dignity was the price they paid for their small measure of security. Mummy, you there? I quit my job today, Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Silence stretched across the phone line, broken only by the distant sounds of Sophia's school cafeteria during lunch period. Margaret could picture her daughter sitting in the faculty room, probably grading papers between bites of a sandwich she'd brought from home to save money, just as Margaret had learned to do. You... what? Sophia's voice was careful, controlled, the tone of someone processing unexpected news that could be either wonderful or catastrophic. I walked out, this morning. After 18 years, I just couldn't do it anymore. Margaret heard Sophia take a deep breath, followed by the sound of a door closing, her daughter finding privacy for a conversation that had suddenly become much more important than lunch break, small talk. Tell me what happened, Sophia said simply. And for the first time in 18 years, Margaret told the complete truth. She described the conversation she'd overheard, the casual cruelty of being compared to a broken appliance, the years of accumulated humiliations that had finally crystallized into a moment of impossible clarity. She spoke about the brown bag lunch that had become the final symbol of her dehumanization, about Mrs. Whitmore's laughter as she discussed Margaret's replacement, about the realization that professional courtesy had been mistaken for human decency. Sophia listened without interruption, and Margaret could hear her daughter's breathing change as the story unfolded. The sharp intake when Margaret described being told to eat outside, the quietly muttered curse when she explained the dog comment, the silence that spoke of tears held back when Margaret revealed how thoroughly her loyalty had been mocked. Mommy, Sophia said finally, her voice thick with emotion, I'm so proud of you. The words hit Margaret like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. In all her catastrophizing about disappointing her daughter, she had never considered that Sophia might be proud of her for finally standing up for herself. But the money, Margaret began. The money will work out, Sophia interrupted. It always does. But your dignity, that's irreplaceable, and you just bought it back. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she sat on the bus stop bench, her uniform drawing curious glances from passers-by who probably wondered why a housekeeper was crying in public in the middle of the afternoon. She realized that for the first time in 18 years, she didn't care what strangers thought of her emotional display. There's something else, Sophia continued, her voice carrying a note of excitement that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Something I've been waiting to tell you until the time was right. Roberto got the scholarship. Margaret's breath caught. Her grandson's application to medical school, the dream that had seemed impossible given their family's financial limitations, had been pending for months. Roberto had been working as a paramedic while taking pre-med courses at community college, determined to become a doctor, despite the odds stacked against a young man from their neighborhood. The full scholarship, Mommy, to UCLA. They're paying for everything, tuition, books, even housing. He starts in the fall. Margaret sobbed openly now. 18 years of suppressed emotions pouring out in the afternoon sunshine as she processed the reality that her grandson, the little boy in the graduation photo that Mrs. Whitmore had mocked, was going to become a doctor. Without Margaret sacrificing her dignity to make it possible, without the Whitmore money that had come at such a devastating personal cost. He wanted to tell you himself, but he's in class until tonight. Mommy, you raised a future doctor. Your sacrifices weren't for nothing. But sitting on that bus stop bench, Margaret realized that her sacrifices had been for nothing. Not because Roberto's success didn't matter, but because she could have supported her family without accepting dehumanization as part of the bargain. She could have demanded respect while providing service. She could have maintained boundaries while offering her best work. She had spent 18 years believing that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford, when the truth was that dignity was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. The bus arrived with the rumbling diesel announcement of transportation that served people like her, people who rode public transit not by choice, but by necessity, who planned their lives around schedules determined by others, who carried their possessions in worn bags and measured distance in time rather than miles. But as Margaret climbed the steps with her worn shoes and faded uniform, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 years, the weight of her own worth, independent of anyone else's approval or disapproval. The driver, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes and calloused hands, looked at her tear-stained face with the recognition of someone who understood that not all crying was the same. "Are you okay, miss?" Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just a bus driver but a man with his own story, his own struggles, his own dignity, that no passenger could diminish simply by virtue of buying a ticket. "I'm going to be," she said, and for the first time in 18 years, she believed it completely. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Margaret watched the Whitmore mansion disappear behind landscaping that she had maintained but never enjoyed, windows that she had cleaned but never looked through, grounds that she had kept beautiful for people who had never seen her as anything more than the means to their comfort. The bus carried her toward East LA, toward her small apartment with its second-hand furniture and bills she wasn't sure how she'd pay next month. But it also carried her toward something else, a future where her worth wouldn't be measured by her willingness to accept less than she deserved. For the first time in 18 years, Margaret Elena Vasquez was unemployed, financially uncertain, and completely free. The Whitmore mansion felt different in Margaret's absence, though it took several hours for the family to fully comprehend why. The silence that had always existed when Margaret worked, the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible, had been replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo through rooms that suddenly felt larger and somehow less comfortable. Mrs. Whitmore discovered the first consequence of Margaret's departure when she went to the kitchen for her afternoon tea and found yesterday's dishes still sitting in the sink, their expensive china and crystal stemware bearing the dried remnants of last night's dinner party. The dishwasher sat empty and open, a metallic mouth waiting to be fed by hands that were no longer there to perform the task. "Jennifer!" Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried through the house with the sharp edge of someone encountering an unacceptable reality. "The kitchen is a disaster. Where is Margaret?" Jennifer appeared in the doorway, wearing yoga clothes that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. Her face flushed from the Pilates session she'd completed in the home gym that Margaret cleaned twice weekly. "Mother, she quit, remember? The dramatic exit this morning, the walking out the front door like she owned the place." Mrs. Whitmore stared at her daughter as if she were speaking a foreign language. In her world, people like Margaret didn't simply disappear. They might be terminated or replaced, but they didn't independently choose to remove themselves from positions that people of their social class should be grateful to hold. "She'll be back," Mrs. Whitmore said with the confidence of someone who had never experienced consequences for treating others badly. "Where else is she going to go? She needs this job more than we need her." But as the afternoon progressed, the evidence of Margaret's absence accumulated like debt. The marble floors that usually gleamed began to show footprints and dust. The bathrooms that were typically spotless started to feel lived in and slightly stale. The flowers that Margaret refreshed daily began to wilt in their expensive vases, their beauty depending entirely on care that was no longer being provided. By evening, when Mr. Whitmore returned from his golf game, expecting dinner to be warming in the oven and his evening clothes laid out in the bedroom, he found instead a house that looked exactly like what it was. A place where wealthy people lived, but no longer had anyone to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. "What do you mean she quit?" he demanded, standing in the kitchen where Margaret had served them breakfast 1,000 times, now cluttered with the detritus of people who had never learned to clean up after themselves. People don't just quit jobs like this. Not at her age, not with her limited options. Mrs. Whitmore was discovering that loading a dishwasher was more complicated than it appeared when someone else had always performed the task. The expensive plates seemed too large for the spaces between the wire racks, and she couldn't remember whether the crystal went on the top or bottom shelf. She had some kind of breakdown, started talking nonsense about dignity and being valued. It was very unprofessional. Mr. Whitmore looked around the kitchen, at the coffee cups in the sink, the newspapers scattered across the breakfast table, the subtle chaos that 18 years of Margaret's labor had kept invisible, and felt something approaching panic. Tomorrow he had colleagues coming for a business dinner, important clients who expected the kind of flawless hospitality that had become his family's signature. "Call the agency," he said. "Get someone here first thing in the morning, and make sure they understand what we expect. We can't have people just walking out whenever they feel like it." But Mrs. Whitmore had already called 3 domestic agencies that afternoon, and the conversations had not gone as she expected. The first agency had a waiting list of 6 weeks for experienced housekeepers. The second required a background check and references that would take 10 days to process. The third, when she mentioned needing someone immediately to replace a long-term employee who had quit without notice, had asked pointed questions about working conditions and compensation that Mrs. Whitmore found impertinent. "These people are getting impossible," she complained to her friend Victoria Hampton during their evening phone call, a ritual that usually involved discussing their staff's various shortcomings while ignoring their own roles in creating workplace problems. "They want references and contracts and all sorts of protections, as if they're doing us a favor instead of the other way around." Victoria's response was not what Mrs. Whitmore expected. "Actually, Regina called me this afternoon," she said, referring to the placement agency they both used. "She said Margaret came in asking about positions with other families. Regina was quite impressed with her, said she'd never seen such detailed references and documentation of her work history." Mrs. Whitmore felt something cold settle in her stomach. Margaret hadn't just quit in an emotional outburst. She had quit with a plan. What kind of documentation? Photographs of her work, before and after shots of rooms she'd restored, testimonials from repair services about her care with antiques. She'd apparently been keeping a portfolio of her achievements for years. Regina said it was the most professional presentation she'd ever seen from someone at Margaret's level. The phrase Margaret's level suddenly sounded different to Mrs. Whitmore's ears, less like a description of social position and more like a professional categorization that Margaret herself had defined and documented, independent of how the Whitmores had chosen to see her. "She had several families interested by the end of the day," Victoria continued. "The Richardsons in Malibu offered her a position with a 30% salary increase and full health benefits. Apparently they'd been looking for someone with experience managing historic properties." Mrs. Whitmore hung up the phone, feeling displaced in her own home. The Richardsons were old money, the kind of family whose approval the Whitmores had always sought but never quite achieved. The idea that Margaret, their Margaret, who had been dismissed as essentially replaceable, was now being courted by more prestigious employers, was both incomprehensible and deeply threatening. The reality of Margaret's value began to reveal itself over the following days, as the Whitmore family attempted to maintain their lifestyle without her invisible support. Jennifer discovered that her bathroom didn't automatically restock itself with the expensive toiletries she favored. Mr. Whitmore learned that his shirts required specific care instructions that he'd never needed to know. Mrs. Whitmore found that managing a household involved dozens of tasks she'd never noticed being performed. The temporary housekeeper who arrived from the agency was efficient but mechanical, completing assigned tasks without the anticipatory care that had made Margaret irreplaceable. She cleaned what was dirty, but didn't notice what needed attention before problems developed. She followed instructions, but didn't solve the small daily crises that Margaret had handled before they became emergencies. Most jarring was the absence of Margaret's presence itself, the quiet competence that had made their home feel effortlessly perfect, the invisible choreography that had allowed them to live like aristocrats without managing the details that sustained their comfort. Young Tommy noticed Margaret's absence most acutely. "When is Margaret coming back?" he asked repeatedly, missing the woman who had remembered his favorite snacks and listened to his stories about school with genuine interest. "Did she go on vacation?" Mrs. Whitmore found herself unable to answer these questions directly. How do you explain to a child that someone left because they were treated badly when you're still insisting that no such thing occurred? The breaking point came during Mr. Whitmore's business dinner, when the temporary housekeeper served the wrong wine with the fish course and forgot to warm the dinner plates, details that Margaret would have managed flawlessly despite never having formal training in fine dining service. The clients, accustomed to the Whitmores' usual standard of hospitality, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about declining expectations and professional disappointment. After the guests left, Mr. Whitmore found himself doing something he'd never done in 18 years. He called Margaret's cell phone directly. The conversation was brief and devastating. Margaret's voice was calm, professional, and completely devoid of the deference he'd grown accustomed to hearing from her. She was calling from her new position. Yes, she'd found employment immediately. No, she wouldn't consider returning. Yes, she was quite happy with her new situation. "Margaret," Mr. Whitmore found himself saying, "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about your departure. Perhaps we could discuss—" "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret interrupted gently, "there was no misunderstanding. I heard exactly what I needed to hear. I understand exactly what I was worth to your family, and now I'm working for people who understand what I'm worth to them." The line went dead, leaving Mr. Whitmore standing in his kitchen, which still wasn't quite clean despite the temporary help, staring at a phone that had just delivered a lesson in consequences he'd never expected to learn. For the first time in their privileged lives, the Whitmores were discovering that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired with money or influence, or the casual assumption that others will always be grateful for whatever they're offered. Margaret Elena Vasquez had taught them that respect, once lost, cannot be demanded back, and they were finally learning that some people, once they remember their worth, can never be made to forget it again. 6 months after walking out of the Whitmore mansion, Margaret Elena Vasquez stood in the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Richardson estate in Malibu, but this time she wasn't cleaning them. She was reviewing the weekly schedule on her tablet, coordinating with the landscaping crew, and confirming details for the charity luncheon that Mrs. Richardson was hosting the following week. Margaret's reflection in those pristine windows showed a woman transformed. Her silver hair, once pulled back in the tight bun of someone trying to disappear, now fell in gentle waves around her shoulders. Her clothes, a crisp navy blazer over well-fitted slacks, spoke of professional competence rather than servile invisibility. Most remarkably, her posture had changed. She stood straight and moved with the confidence of someone who knew her value and expected others to recognize it as well. The Richardson family had hired her not as a housekeeper, but as an estate manager, a title that came with a salary that was indeed 30% higher than what the Whitmores had paid, plus comprehensive health insurance, 3 weeks of paid vacation, and something Margaret had never experienced before, genuine respect for her expertise. Eleanor Richardson, a woman in her 70s whose family had built their fortune in California real estate 3 generations earlier, had been impressed not just by Margaret's references, but by her obvious intelligence and organizational skills. "I don't need someone to clean my toilets," she had said during Margaret's interview. "I need someone to run my household like the complex operation it actually is. Someone who understands that managing a property like this requires the same skills as running a small business." The difference was evident in every aspect of Margaret's new position. She had her own office in the estate's main house, equipped with a computer, printer, and filing system for managing vendor contracts, staff schedules, and the social calendar that filled Mrs. Richardson's retirement with purpose. She supervised a team of specialists, housekeepers, gardeners, maintenance staff, rather than performing every task herself until her body broke down from the physical demands. Most importantly, she was consulted rather than commanded. When Mrs. Richardson wanted to host events, she asked for Margaret's recommendations about catering, flowers, and logistics. When problems arose with contractors or service providers, Margaret was empowered to negotiate solutions rather than simply enduring whatever treatment was offered. She had a voice in decisions that affected her work environment, and that voice was not only heard but valued. Margaret's transformation extended beyond her professional life. For the first time in decades, she had the emotional energy to nurture relationships that had withered during her years of exhausting service to the Whitmores. She joined Sophia for regular Sunday dinners, arriving as a guest rather than someone too tired from serving others to fully engage with her own family. She attended Roberto's medical school orientation, sitting in the auditorium with other proud family members, her presence no longer determined by whether she could get time off from work that treated her as expendable. The arthritis that had made her final years at the Whitmores increasingly painful began to improve under the care of doctors she could finally afford to see regularly. The stress-related insomnia that had plagued her for years faded as she learned to sleep in a bed that belonged to her, in an apartment she could afford, without constantly calculating which bills could be delayed until the next paycheck. Most profoundly, Margaret had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under years of making herself small. She enrolled in evening classes at the local community college, not for career advancement, but for the pure joy of learning that had been impossible when every free moment was spent recovering from exhaustion. She studied art history and discovered a passion for understanding the paintings and sculptures she had dusted for years without really seeing. She took Spanish literature courses and reconnected with the poetry that had sustained her through difficult times in her youth. Margaret also began volunteering at a local women's shelter, using her organizational skills to help other women navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives after crisis. She understood, with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had reclaimed her own dignity, that financial independence was only part of the journey. The harder work was learning to believe you deserved better treatment and having the courage to demand it. "You teach them that their worth isn't negotiable," she explained to Sophia during one of their Sunday dinners, describing her work with women who had been convinced, like Margaret herself had been, that survival required accepting whatever treatment they were offered. Once they understand that, everything else becomes possible. The women at the shelter saw in Margaret something that inspired them, proof that it was never too late to choose dignity over security, that age and limited education didn't disqualify someone from demanding respect, that years of being undervalued didn't have to define the rest of your story. Margaret's new apartment, though modest, reflected her transformed sense of self. The walls held artwork she had chosen because it moved her, not because it matched someone else's decor. The bookshelf displayed novels and poetry collections that fed her soul rather than gathering dust as symbols of leisure she couldn't afford. The kitchen, though small, was equipped with tools that reflected her own preferences for cooking rather than whatever leftovers she'd been allowed to take from someone else's refrigerator. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit by her window with a cup of tea, looking out at the city lights and marveling at the simple pleasure of time that belonged entirely to her. No one was timing her breaks or monitoring her efficiency. No one was commenting on her appearance or questioning her dedication. She was free to think her own thoughts, feel her own feelings, and plan her own future without regard for anyone else's approval. The freedom was intoxicating in ways she hadn't expected. After decades of structuring her entire existence around other people's needs and schedules, the autonomy to make decisions based on her own preferences felt almost overwhelming at first. What did she want for dinner? What time did she want to wake up on her days off? How did she want to spend her birthday? These seemed like simple questions, but for someone who had spent 18 years with no control over the most basic aspects of her daily life, they represented a fundamental shift in how she understood her place in the world. Margaret had also reconnected with friendships that had been neglected during her years of servitude. Carmen, a woman she'd known since childhood, had maintained their connection despite Margaret's long absences from social gatherings she'd been too exhausted to attend. Now they met for coffee regularly, two women in their 60s who had survived different types of challenges, but shared the wisdom that comes from refusing to accept that struggle is the same thing as defeat. "For you look 10 years younger," Carmen observed during one of their conversations, studying Margaret's face with the attention of someone who had known her before the Whitmores had taught her to make herself invisible. "But more than that, you look like yourself again, like the woman I knew before you disappeared into that job." The comment had stayed with Margaret for days, making her realize how completely she had lost herself in the role of the perfect servant. She had become so skilled at anticipating and fulfilling other people's needs that she had forgotten she had needs of her own that deserved attention and care. But perhaps the most meaningful change in Margaret's life was the relationship she had developed with Mrs. Richardson, who treated her with the professional courtesy that Margaret had mistaken for personal affection during her years with the Whitmores. Mrs. Richardson was kind but not condescending, appreciative but not patronizing. She understood that gratitude was a two-way street. She valued Margaret's competence and reliability, and Margaret valued being trusted with significant responsibilities and treated as an essential part of the household's success. "I don't know how I managed this place without you," Mrs. Richardson had said recently, and Margaret recognized the comment as genuine appreciation rather than the kind of manipulative flattery designed to keep employees satisfied with inadequate compensation. When Mrs. Richardson said it, Margaret believed her, and more importantly, Margaret knew that if Mrs. Richardson ever began taking her for granted or treating her poorly, she would have the strength to leave and find something better, because that was the most profound transformation of all. Margaret Elena Vasquez had learned that she was worth fighting for, even when the person she had to fight was herself. 2 years after Margaret's quiet revolution, the invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with elegant calligraphy that she recognized immediately. Mrs. Richardson's annual charity gala, supporting the Los Angeles Women's Empowerment Foundation, would be held at the Beverly Hills Hotel, just 3 miles from the Whitmore mansion where Margaret had once scrubbed floors until her knees bled. Margaret studied the invitation from her office at the Richardson estate, remembering the woman who had once eaten lunch, standing in someone else's kitchen, grateful for scraps of respect that weren't really respect at all. That woman felt like a character from a story she'd read long ago, someone she'd known intimately, but could barely recognize now. The gala would honor women who had overcome significant obstacles to achieve professional success and give back to their communities. Mrs. Richardson had insisted that Margaret attend as her guest, not as staff, wearing an evening gown instead of a uniform, sitting at the head table instead of serving it. "You embody everything this event celebrates," Mrs. Richardson had said when she extended the invitation. A woman who refused to accept that her circumstances defined her worth, who found the courage to demand better, and who now uses her success to lift up others. The foundation needs to hear your story, Margaret's story. For most of her adult life, she'd believed she didn't have one worth telling, just decades of quiet service, invisible labor, and swallowed dignity. Now she understood that her story was exactly the kind that needed telling, how a woman could spend 18 years believing she was worth less than she was, and how she could reclaim not just her dignity, but her entire sense of self. The night of the gala, Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror in a midnight blue dress that Sophia had helped her choose, elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but not trying too hard to belong in spaces where she'd once been unwelcome. Her reflection showed a woman who looked comfortable in her own skin, someone who had learned to take up space without apologizing for it. The Beverly Hills Hotel ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth and influence that had once intimidated Margaret into silence. Tonight, she moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, introducing herself to strangers not as someone's employee, but as Margaret Vasquez, estate manager and volunteer coordinator. She shook hands with philanthropists and business leaders who listened to her opinions about organizational efficiency and community outreach with genuine interest. During the cocktail hour, Margaret found herself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Chen, a renowned pediatrician who had grown up in poverty and now ran free clinics throughout Los Angeles. "The hardest part," Dr. Chen was saying, "isn't escaping difficult circumstances. It's learning to believe you deserve better circumstances." Margaret nodded, thinking of the women at the shelter who still flinched when spoken to kindly, who apologized for taking up space, who had been so thoroughly convinced of their unworthiness that generosity felt like a trap. "I spent 18 years accepting treatment that I knew was wrong," Margaret said, "because I thought survival required accepting whatever I was offered. I confused gratitude with dignity. It wasn't until I lost both that I realized they were never the same thing." Dr. Chen studied Margaret with the attention of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "What changed? What made you finally demand better?" Margaret considered the question, remembering that moment in the marble hallway when she'd heard herself being discussed like a broken appliance scheduled for replacement. "I realized that the people I was trying so hard to please would never see me as human anyway. Once I accepted that their approval was impossible to earn, I was free to focus on my own. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle touch on Margaret's shoulder. She turned to find Tommy Whitmore, now 10 years old and taller than she remembered, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. "Margaret!" Tommy's face lit up with genuine joy. "I thought that was you. Mom, this is Margaret. I told you about her. She used to work for Grandma and Grandpa, but she was always nice to me." The woman, Jennifer's sister-in-law, Margaret realized, smiled politely but with obvious discomfort. She'd clearly heard stories about Margaret's dramatic departure from the family, but seeing her at an exclusive charity gala, dressed elegantly and conversing as an equal with prominent community members, created a cognitive dissonance that was visible in her expression. "Tommy talks about you often," the woman said carefully. "He asks why you don't visit anymore." Margaret knelt to Tommy's eye level, just as she had that morning 2 years ago, when her world had shifted on its axis. "I have a new job now, sweetheart. One where I help other people find their way to better situations, just like I found mine." "Are you happy?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children possess. "Very happy," Margaret answered honestly. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Tommy beamed as if Margaret's happiness were somehow his personal achievement. "I'm glad. You always looked sad at our house, even when you smiled." The observation, delivered with innocent clarity, hung in the air between Margaret and Jennifer's sister-in-law, a child's truth that cut through years of adult rationalizations about appropriate treatment of employees. Later, as Margaret was leaving the ladies' room, she encountered Mrs. Whitmore herself, emerging from a stall with the careful composure of someone who had not expected to face a ghost from her past in such elegant surroundings. For a moment, both women stood frozen in the marble and gold bathroom, their reflections multiplied in the ornate mirrors that surrounded them. Mrs. Whitmore looked older, Margaret thought, and somehow smaller, not physically, but in presence, as if certainty about her place in the world had been replaced by something less stable. "Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mrs. Richardson is a board member of the foundation," Margaret replied simply. "I coordinate much of her philanthropic work now." The conversation that followed was brief and polite. Inquiries about health, mentions of mutual acquaintances, the kind of surface pleasantries that people exchange when deeper topics are too dangerous to explore. But underneath the civility, Margaret could sense Mrs. Whitmore's discomfort with this reversal of roles, this evidence that the woman she'd dismissed as essentially worthless had somehow achieved the kind of social standing that Mrs. Whitmore herself had always sought. "I hope you're well," Mrs. Whitmore said as they prepared to return to the ballroom. "I'm very well," Margaret replied, "better than I've ever been." And she meant it completely. The evening's program included testimonials from women who had overcome various obstacles, domestic violence, poverty, discrimination, illness, to achieve success in fields ranging from medicine to education to entrepreneurship. When Mrs. Richardson introduced Margaret to the audience of 500 guests, describing her journey from invisible service to meaningful leadership, Margaret felt no trace of the shame that had once defined her. Margaret Vasquez reminds us, Mrs. Richardson concluded, that dignity is not something others can give or take away. It's something we must claim for ourselves, often in the face of people who benefit from our believing we don't deserve it. The applause that followed felt different from any recognition Margaret had ever received. Not the polite acknowledgement of good service, but genuine appreciation for courage that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of others she now served. Driving home through Beverly Hills after the gala, Margaret passed the street where the Whitmore mansion sat behind its perfectly manicured hedges. She slowed briefly, not from nostalgia, but from simple curiosity about a place that had once defined the boundaries of her world. The house looked the same, imposing, immaculate, expensive, but Margaret no longer saw it as a symbol of success she could never achieve. Now she understood it for what it truly was, a beautiful prison where people lived in isolation from their own humanity, surrounded by luxury but disconnected from the kind of wealth that actually mattered. Margaret Elena Vasquez had learned that true prosperity wasn't measured in marble floors or designer furnishings. It was measured in the freedom to choose your own path, to demand respect, and to believe that your worth was not determined by others' willingness to recognize it. She had spent 18 years believing that she was lucky to serve people who saw her as fundamentally less valuable than themselves. Now she understood that they had been lucky to have her service, and their failure to recognize that truth was their loss, not hers. The women at the shelter where Margaret volunteered often asked her how she'd found the courage to leave a secure job for an uncertain future. Her answer was always the same. I realized that uncertainty with dignity was better than certainty without it. Once you understand that, every door becomes possible to open. As Margaret pulled into her apartment complex, she thought about tomorrow's schedule: a budget meeting with Mrs. Richardson, lunch with Sophia to plan Roberto's graduation celebration, an evening session with the women's group she facilitated. A full life, chosen rather than imposed, meaningful rather than merely endured. For the first time in decades, Margaret Elena Vasquez fell asleep in a bed that belonged to her, in a home she had chosen, dreaming dreams that no one else had the power to diminish. Have you ever found yourself accepting less than you deserved because you thought survival required it? Have you known someone who discovered their worth only after others had tried to convince them they had none? If this story touched you, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread this message to others who might need to hear that their dignity is never negotiable, no matter what circumstances might suggest otherwise. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.